Kenneth Gergen is the Gill and Frank Muston Professor of Psychology at Swarthmore College. He is the author of numerous papers and books, most notably The Saturated Self, which explores the impact of technology and culture on self-identity. In Realities and Relationships and An Invitation to Social Construction, Dr. Gergen unpacks the reform movement of psychology known as social construction, which asserts that human beings are formed socially and that all human knowledge is relational. Dr. Gergen frequently lectures nationally and internationally on social construction. Most significantly, he is a co-founder and director of the Taos Institute in New Mexico, a community of scholars dedicated to proliferating social constructionist principles. He is also a member of the American Psychological Association, an associate editor of American Psychologist. Throughout his career, Dr. Gergen has demonstrated a commitment to integrating social constructionist thought with other disciplines, including theology.
When you were born and raised within an individualistic worldview, like most of us were, you tend to see reality through reductionist lenses that break it down into pieces and parts. Seeing the world through relational lenses is different indeed. Sometimes it requires a gestalt shift, a kind of personal transformation, not unlike a religious conversion. Kenneth Gergen is a scholar who has devoted his career to trying to figure out how all the human practices and institutional traditions that have been expressed in individualistic terms for centuries can be reconceptualized as forms of relatedness. In this quest for a new relational vocabulary of being, he has strayed across many a disciplinary boundary. In fact, in many respects, Ken Gergen's search for interdisciplinary partners is what has inspired this conference. Today, Professor Gergen is going to talk about his own journey into a conception of relationships as the source of all meaning. Then he's going to help us to explore the sacred dimension of relatedness in our own personal experience. Here to talk to us about the relational realization of the sacred is Kenneth Gergen.
Thank you, Fred. I think I'll begin with a song. Oh, he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Hymns like that are very important to me, because they were part of the beginning for me of a spiritual journey, which in some sense begins at 10 years old. I grew up in a family which was, I'd say, deeply agnostic. My father was a professor of mathematics, my mother a sometimes writer. And I knew nothing of religion. I was sent to a public school in the countryside near Duke University, and most of my friends at 10 years old were Southern Baptist children, kids, my friends. And I sort of fell in with them and began to go to church with them, and over time it was as if religion was like, wow, oh, this is fantastic. I never heard of it before. I deeply embraced it. Very important to me. I became a true believer. I was there on Sunday morning. I was there on Sunday night. I was in midweek prayer meetings. I would take pamphlets at the weekends and study the Bible and so on, so on. My family thought I was absolutely nuts. They thought I probably needed a therapist. What, we did this, we raised this. Yet there were questions, always questions. And let me raise one of them because it will come back later to haunt us. And that is, we would have Holy Communion, and these were very important experiences. And we would be told, once we were given this glass of grape juice, that this was the blood of Christ, but we could not partake of communion unless we truly believed. So here I am, a kid of 12, asking myself, do I truly believe? Do I truly believe? How was I to answer that question? Where am I going to look? Inside, what part of me was I to examine to find out whether I truly believed? Perhaps I only partly believed. Perhaps it was superficial. Perhaps it was just Sunday. I mean, how do I know that I truly believe? So I would sit there and try to make up assessment devices. And I'd say, well, all right, if my hand sweats on this glass and there's enough perspiration by the time we have this communion, then I know that's an indication of my heart, so I must truly believe. Questions like that went on. They became, sort of through the teen years, questions of, well, what does one do about masturbation, and why are there no blacks in this church, and so on and so on. I moved to a city school, and I needed something, religion that was somehow less intense, less demanding, less. So I found Methodism. And that was fine for a while, until I arrived at Yale. At Yale, I wrote my first paper in philosophy on a proof of God. And I have never seen a paper so fully attacked by any professor in my life. It was like, just killed. I went on, and within the sciences, by and large, all that I had brought there as religious belief was pretty much challenged. All the stories of resurrection, of virgin birth, and so on, were looked at as so many sort of medieval folk tales, and to be abandoned, certainly, and the results of basically dogmatic traditions without any grounds. And in place of those traditions, there was science, the certitude of science, the exactness, the methodology, the progress, and so on. Now, over time, with enough very significant people who seemed so secure in that belief saying that and judging me on my ability to replicate that, I became a scientist. That became my calling. And I went into psychology because that seemed to be that one discipline which had the possibility through empirical research to somehow help humanity. It was leading to a helping profession, and I could do it through scientific methods and through the certitudes that science would eventually allow me to reach. Now that was okay for a while. That was a honeymoon period in there where it seemed to be working, and I really liked it. But over time, again, the questions emerge. One of the hardest ones for me was, it seemed as if psychology as a field, and not just unique to psychology, was made up of sort of bounded principalities, so that if you were in psychoanalytics, you were hated by, let's say, the behaviors. You were just out of the club, out of science. And if you were in behaviors, you were hated by the humanists. That was like really bad. And cognition came along, the cognitivists came along and simply sort of abandoned it all as being stuff and nonsense until the biologically oriented come along and say cognitive is a folklore. So this sounded like echoes after a while, like, wait a minute, this sounds like what I went through when I came to college, each group putting down the other group, like religion had been put down for me when I came into college. What am I to do here? Who's got the right truth? And then I began to look around at academics, and it is almost exactly like this. Go on a campus, there are like walled fortifications where we do biology, and we do physics, and we do sociology, and so on. And by and large, they don't speak to each other. By and large, they're generally disparage of what each other does. They find it either woolly-minded or irrelevant or mere words or bad science. Or, there's pretty much a kind of disparagement then that moves across the fields. Now, at this point, it begins, I wonder, well, all right, well, where's the chief science, or where's the chief truth? What building is that located in? Who has the truly true? And where was I to find that? This becomes almost a sense of, for me, of despair. What was worth doing, after all? Who had it right? And I began to feel as if somehow the world were made up of circus tents. And every department had its circus tent, and every group within a department had its circus tent, and religions had their circus tents, and government, and so on, and so on, and so on, each proclaiming the great things that could be found if you'd only go into our tent. And I became somewhat disenchanted with the whole enterprise, and went through kind of a nihilistic phase. Now, the nice quote from Nelson Goodman will give you a sense of what the problem was, his ways of world making as a philosopher. If I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? I'm not in that nihilistic space anymore. I've been very much part of a set of dialogues which have moved through the academy, they've moved through the culture, they've moved across the globe now. Under many, many terms, many, many guises, some of them you'll recognize, some of them you won't like. They're not all the same. They're a set of dialogues which are about these issues: truth, objectivity, rationality, principle, right, foundations. They go under such names as postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-enlightenment, post-foundationalism, social constructionism, and so on. And I teach entire courses on these things, and I won't belabor you with all of the dialogues and they're interesting, fascinating. Give me 2 more hours and we can really get into it, but let me simply share what I think is the nugget for me, which is going to get us along in this spiritual story that I'm telling. And that is that somehow it's the matrix of relationship out of which meaning comes, out of which any of those commitments come. The matrix of relationship. That is not out of my head as an observer, private observer, and not out of a community which is separate from me, but out of a set of relationships of which I am a part. Out of relationship derives the very concepts of meaning which we use in these various domains. Let me press on further to return to that question of how I can know whether I've truly believed. Now, I can sort of ask myself, can I think? Or am I angry? Or do I love? I can ask myself, do I intend to do something? Because intentions and love and anger and rationality are all terms that we share within our communities. They are terms that make us intelligible to each other. I have a little bit more difficult time asking myself if I'm melancholy. And we had that term in the 16th century. You could write a 500-page book on melancholy and all of its characteristics and its causes and cures. We scarcely use the term anymore. Not sure what it means. It would be very difficult to call up your boss someday and say, hey, look, I can't come in today because I've got a fearful bout of melancholy. You can say it, but you won't get very far. Now, I can not tell you very much about the nature of my Atman, or whether I feel Fago, or am I, because those aren't parts of Western intelligibility, parts of Hindu intelligibility, parts of Micronesian intelligibility, parts of Japanese intelligibility. We don't use those terms. We don't have the conditions under which to talk about them. So in some sense, what I can talk about in terms of who I am derives it from sets of communities in which I'm engaged. And what about the world outside? Enough about myself. What about the world outside? What about what we call the material world? Well, let's take an example. Behold the cross. Now, for many of us, that cross is endowed with deep symbolic significance. We look at it and there are ripples of feeling, sensibility, commitment that go with that cross. There are many people in this room who would die for the significance of what that means. Our community. You take a community of art historians, they're not going to feel that way about it. They're going to have another entire vocabulary. They're going to begin to look at the way in which that reflects various sorts of medieval forms and how it's changed and how it might resemble Riemann Schneider or someone else or not. And if I approach it as a geologist from that community, I'm going to be interested in the composition of that marble and where it might have been mined and whether it's similar or not to, let's say, the marble in Carrara. And if I'm an atomic physicist, Carrara and resurrection and Riemann Schneider are just not in the vocabulary. It's just an atomic structure. All the rest of it is fiction. Well, in some sense, then, the meaning of that derives from sets of relationships, from the process of relationships. Now, I take two lessons from that, which to me are of tremendous significance. And one of them is that we need not compare truths to find out which one is truly true or right or superior. That we can replace that kind of search with some kind of mutual appreciation or mutual exploration of the potentials for various forms of calling, for various forms of interpretation. Not asking then whether science is truly true and religion is not, that the whole question is abandoned. It's true within its own frame. So is religion, true within its own frame, but that doesn't give it a transcendent quality. It says, look, it's our community. And these terms that we have for understanding that object are tremendously important, not for purposes of, let's say, prediction and control. They're important for other means. Those terms function in other ways for us. That cross evokes for us senses of social responsibility, of love, of caring, of morality, of senses of asking ourselves what this is truly all about and where are we going. All those kinds of questions. That cross functions in that way in terms of our interpretation. And those words are tremendously important in sustaining traditions under which things like caring and love and responsibility are enormously important. We simply can't explain it away. We don't have to ask if it's true or not. Ask what those terms do for us and with us and for us as a community, for our culture. In the same way, let's say the community of physicists will have another language which enables them to do something that we call harnessing energy or atomic energy. That's what that language enables them to do in that community. It's not because the language is true, it just happens to be functional in doing something else. You don't have to ask whether biology is true, you don't have to ask whether Darwinianism is truer than creationism. And it's a pseudo question, because those are simply ways of understanding which function in different forms. And we shouldn't ask for the religious way, the creationist story, to explain various fossil formations. That's not what the language is for. Nor will we ever build a language of morality, of concern, of caring, of justice, out of a language of biology. We honor the traditions for what they do, explore them for their potentials. and what they can't do. I think some of you might be prepared to take that both-and position, one which I think is increasingly congenial within the culture. There's another piece of this which falls out, which, however, will allow us to get on with the spiritual story, which I find just of enormous importance, and it's related again to this entire colloquy in which we're engaged. And it has to do with our Western tradition of I, of looking at ourselves as the molecules or the atoms of society. That is, society is made up of individuals. Groups are made up of individuals, so on. And whether we trace it back, let's say, to Aristotle's notion of the soul within the person that animates, or the way in which that term became used then later by certainly Catholicism as a soul within the person, which could be saved or pure or not, in a way that gets picked up later with a whole vocabulary of emotional significance, as in Romanticism, what I love, what I feel, whether it goes, we go in the contemporary world of cognition. That is, all those traditions and all of the institutions which have come out of those, democracy, capitalism, psychiatry, and so on, are concerned with the state of the individual mind, because that's what matters. Right? So we've got like several thousand terms in the English vernacular for states of mind. I can talk about states of mind all day. I don't have very many terms to talk about relatedness. We're impoverished that way. It's like having 1,000 terms to talk about the individual chess pieces and nothing to talk about the game. Now, what this kind of emphasis then on the relational matrix of meaning does is to shift the figure from the ground. It says, look, it's not the individual mind, it's not the individual atom which creates relationship, it's relationship which is prior to individual mind. Relational process is that which gives rise to meaning. How would an individual mind begin to think about, for example, justice or the economic policies without a community providing the terms in which to think those things? What would thinking be about if you didn't have the concepts provided by relationships? It is to say, and to go back to Descartes for a moment, how did Descartes know he was thinking? That is, he doubted everything else, but he was very sure about one thing: he was thinking. Now, how was he so certain about that? After all, he was like me, asking myself whether I truly believed. What made him so secure about it, that is, he lived within a tradition or community which could make that intelligible. So thinking didn't come prior. Thinking was, you might say, an afterthought. That we could replace cogito ergo sum with communicamos ergo sum. We communicate. We communicate, therefore I am, therefore I can be anything. It is out of communion, the act of communion, that I become. All right. Now, again, this is the spiritual story, and I've talked a lot about the dropping away from religion and the way in which I essentially went through science and became disenchanted with science as a truth teller, and I end up in relationalism. And still we're pretty far away from a spiritual story, aren't we? Well, I don't think so. So I need a second chapter here. I need a second chapter where I can talk about the sacred dimension of the relational. Now, if you can go with me this far, all right, far enough to see that out of relationships meaning derives. Everything that we take to be real, everything that we take to be good, that gives us vitality in life, that gives us direction, that gives us significance, everything that is anything for us grows out of relationship. If you can take that on, entertain that possibility, then it suggests that what we really need to know about is relationship itself. That's where we really need to place our attention. Have to describe it, define it, explore it, document it, and so on. And then we'll know how to go on. And that seems fine up to a point until you realize what is it that I can say about relationship that isn't already in some frame of reference? What is it that I could say about relationship that isn't already wedded to some tradition of meaning and is limited by those traditions? Or paraphrase Wittgenstein, say the limits of our relationship are the limits of our world. And if that's the case, then all I can understand about relationship is already parts of relationship itself, and I can't stand outside of those. That I am historically, culturally delimited. So what happens? Then what we have is a situation like as follows, that where that process, which gives meaning, which gives everything, which gives a sense of the moral, the sense of the holy, the sense of justice, the sense of what is right and good and true, is ineffable, inarticulable, impossible to lay hold of. We can't know it. We can imagine, we can approach it, we can create metaphors, but we can't own it in the sense of possessing it as a form of knowledge. It can't be ours, sense of having it as an object of knowledge. Now when I say that, make that argument, some of you will begin to say, wait a minute, this sounds very much like things we already know about. Herein lies a possible convergence between a relational ontology and what we know from various forms of religious tradition, Christianity very much included. Because there is within various traditions, for one, the sense that whatever is sacred, whatever is holy, whatever is most important, that font of whatever is ineffable, that we can't grasp it. That is already there for us. Here's the book of Romans. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. Gets picked up again in the 4th century by negative theology, a via negativa, in which we are looked at as humans as incapable of really comprehending the deity. And that, for example, love may bind us together, but we cannot comprehend because it is so much larger, so much more glorious than us, that we have not the possibility of comprehension. Consider the Buddhist theme here in Zen Buddhism. The doubt about logic, or the doubt about human rationality, is being able to reach that which essentially can't be said, but which is somehow fundamental. And the koans, which are used to break up rationality, to sort of make you aware that asking questions of profound significance have answers. Here's a koan: who is the Buddha? The young monk asked the priest. 3 pounds of flax. That's nonsense, but that's the point. It's nonsense which is making sense. It's nonsense to unseat the very idea that you can, as mortals, make sense of it all. Here's a 12th century priest, Tai Hui, and think here about Nelson Goodman's statement a few minutes ago. So he's a priest, he's a teacher, and he holds up a bamboo stick. And he says, now if you call this a stick, you affirm it. And if you call it not a stick, you negate it. Beyond words that affirm and words that negate, what would you call it? All right, so that sense of that whatever is most profoundly important, that we cannot ascertain it. It is going to remain there as an ineffable. And secondly, that ineffability, that source, is somehow sacred. It is the ultimate source that we owe awe to. That, many of those religious feelings that we have. Here it is in Christianity. I mean, Colin Gutton did a very nice job of trying to point out the perichoresis, or the tradition of the Trinity, in which you have three in one, but the three constitute each other. You can't just tear them apart. They're each unique, but yet they don't exist without the other. Now, that's an interesting concept, because it's a concept which is not atomic, where each thing is alone and isolated. It's a concept of God in which it is pieces linked and mutually constituted. Now, Catherine Keller goes on in her interesting work, The Broken Web, to talk about the way in which that Trinity, that perichoric concept, has been in some sense diluted, that is, has been remade as a oneness, so that the three in one become an isolated unit somewhere out there. Not of us, but somewhere else. And she wants, from a feminist standpoint, to say, well, this kind of looks very much like the reinstantiation of the patriarchy, with some male figure out there, three in one, but still there above and beyond and in control. And wants to try to revise that notion, as in some sense Colin was trying to do, to say, why not try to conceptualize ourselves in that way, in terms of our own relationships? That is, to mend the broken web, so that yes, we all may be parts of the web, but yet we don't exist as parts without each other. Isolate pieces, but you can't disentangle them, or they wouldn't be pieces. It wouldn't be a web. You also find this kind of thinking about the relational sacred in other traditions as well. In the Hebrew, classic Hebrew, here's one scholar talking about classic Hebrew. All men are interdependent and interconnected like the links of a chain. And that tradition of relationalism, as many of you know, gets picked up again as sort of the modern echo of it is Martin Buber, and I and thou. He talks about in the beginning is the relationship. Again, repeating that kind of Hebrew refrain, different form. Here is in Islam, Mevlana Rumi, Islamic mystic, 13th century. At one time, when life was fully apparent, your soul was one with my soul. All we were, open or secret, was part of the same whole. If the words you and I are pronouns, they're only terms. In truth, there can be no separate you or I at all. Out of Hinduism, here's the Bhagavad Gita in the 6th century. Through all forms whatsoever runs one life, immortal, making indivisible all those that seem endlessly divided. And indeed, the very word religion derives from the Latin meaning to bind back. What I'm trying to propose here, then, that this relationship as a kind of a font of all is unfathomable, and that this unfathomable origin of significance is divine, and that the relational process is inhabited by divine presence. All right. So then again, the move from the relational back to the spiritual. Let me talk for a few minutes about what this might entail. What would follow if the divine is the relational? Let me begin here, this last section, by talking a little bit about another tradition of writing, which has had some momentum over the past 30 years or so, which is a concern with the sacred and the profane, and the way in which the language or discourse of the sacred has grown slowly into disuse and is being replaced by a language of the profane, the day-to-day language of material. Largely the language that falls out of materialism. And what we give up when we lose that sacred language. Here's Mircea Eliade in The Sacred Profane, for example, saying, the sacred language, we can't afford to give it up because it's what gives value to things. It's what makes something important. What lifts something out is saying, this really is important to me. This is worth doing. This I cherish. The profane language doesn't allow that. It simply reduces things to analyzed, observable pieces. Things just are. Science or materialism is about what is. It just is. This is the way it operates. This is the way it functions. So that life or death just are. Marriage is the social convention. Family is just a social convention. These are not especially significant. You need another language for that. You need a sacred language. And Morris Berman takes that even a step further. In his book, Re-Enchantment of the World, Berman argues that the profane language is deeply problematic because that language simply reduces nature to an is, which has no particular importance except perhaps for our purposes. And he recalls sort of earlier religious times when nature was animated in various religions in which the spirits dwelled in nature. So you cared about nature because that was holy. And when we lose that capacity to see the sacred in nature, so do we open it for any ravages which we happen to want to perpetrate. He argues for the reanimation, the resacralization of nature. Now, it's in this respect that, to me, I see an enormous significance in moving in this relational direction. Because what we have here is the possibility of seeing the sacred as sort of inhabiting everyday life. The divine as being not somewhere else, but among us, the potential. It's sort of removing the sense of the divine as being a vertical relationship, and we are sort of secondary as a horizontal relationship, because that relationship with God, he walks with me, and he talks with me. Doing here is recreating this to say, look, the divine may be immanent in all that we do. We have the capacity now in our relationships to create the divine, to create the sacred. It depends on how we go about it. We have in our daily relationships a kind of hierophonic potential, that is the potential to make sacred what it is we do in the smallest of instances. Let me say a little bit more. I mean, we need some distinction here among forms of relationship. Imagine a sort of a domain of relatedness, a process in which gives rise to mutual nurturance, gives rise to the value, gives rise to the sense of sustenance, which gives rise to creates the process for continuous coordination. That, to me, is the form of relationship in which the holy is immanent. That is, which creates the process, which rejuvenates, which makes possible meaning. Those relationships, those forms of relationship which reduce the possibility for meaning, which divide us, separate us, alienate us, lead us into mutual destruction, are like cutting off the voices. They're cutting off the voices that are necessary to create meaning at all. You reduce me to a single person without any relationship, and there is no meaning. And if I were to do away with everybody who didn't see the world in exactly the same way I saw it, there would be only one man left standing, and then there would be no meaning at all. So when we begin to alienate, divide, suppress, oppress, we begin to set conditions slouching toward the end of any meaning, and thus the loss of the sacred altogether. Now, again, that may seem pretty idealistic too. What do I do about the complicated problems? Okay, so this sounds all right. It sounds sort of interesting, but after all, you have major problems of evil in the globe, major problems of disparity and injustice. What do we do with those? One thing I don't think I want to do is to provide any answers. In fact, I've become very suspicious of answers. Having an answer, having an authoritative answer about things, is like closing off the conversation. Like saying, this is it. No more words. this is it, listen, take it, this is the way we're going. So in some sense, you close off the conversation, you close off the dialogues, you close off the possibilities for creating meaning, you close off possible options, you close off the possibility for the coming together of people. And it's the same way I feel about scientific certitude. Be careful of certitude. Be careful of my own certitude. Because certitude has a way of closing off the conversation. If it just is. We don't go beyond that point. It just is. Don't talk about it any further. And again, meaning begins to die off. Potential. So rather than looking for answers to all those complicated questions, we might rather set in motion sets of dialogues, which many, many people can participate in, which that might expand. There will be no final answers. There will be ambiguity, but let's embrace that ambiguity, because it means that we are still in dialogue. We are still making meaning together. I will share for a few minutes several kinds of approaches that I found useful. They're not answers, but they're just ways that I've found thinking and acting, which right now, for a time, have been useful to me. First one is something like this. There aren't any villains. There aren't any fools. There are no evil people. There are no stupid people. You say, whoa, wait a minute. Sure there are. Evil is all about us. What do we do about neo-Nazism? What do we do about the mafia? What do we do about atrocities? What do we do about terrorists? What do we do about Timothy McVeigh? Sure, evil is everywhere. And stupidity, well, we don't have to go very far to find that. I won't say more about my politics. But it's interesting that none of those villains and none of those fools are really here among us. I mean, it's like we have a gathering of all the good people. Why is that? I think in large measure it's because what we conceptualize as good and evil grows out of a matrix of relationship. So when we come together and when we can negotiate and coordinate, we will generate almost inevitably a sense of the good, which holds us together, something that's worth doing, which holds us together. And as long as we stay in those pockets, in those matrices of relationship that are cozy, we will find evil in others. That we ourselves will never sort of systematically perpetrate evil. I mean, it's almost unimaginable, because, I mean, you don't wake up in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to do some evil. Good day to do evil. I mean, we don't do evil. We do things that seem reasonable to us. And by the same token, all of us in this room are evil in somebody else's world. All the clothing that we wear, the cars that we drive, the beliefs that we espouse are all evil for someone else. They participate in the exploitation of foreign workers and globalization processes. They are religious infamy, and so on, worth eradicating. We are all evil to somebody else. Now, there's one kind of profound implication of this, which I worry a lot about, but it's very helpful to me, and it says something like this. You know, when we come together and we create the good, and things are nourishing, and things are really moving fine, and we really enjoy that, and it's a sense of right and righteousness, that what we are creating is an exterior which is not that. So every movement to the creation of the good is creating something else which is not the good, somebody else which isn't in that circle. And that process is, to me, virtually inevitable. That all the coordinations are creating uncoordination or disconnects divides. So this raises the question then not of trying to pursue the good, because that's virtually inevitable to our relationships in which we're involved. We will do something like that within our relationships because it's reasonable to do that. Real question is, what do you do with the divides, with the disconnects? Because those are where we slouch towards the end of meaning. That's where we begin the process of alienation, degradation, and ultimate annihilation of other peoples. How do we deal with the disconnects? Because therein, you see, is in some sense, the true realization of the sacred. Reconnecting, the process of meaning can once again flourish. I'll give you just one example of this. I work in a nonprofit organization called the Taos Institute, and we try to use a lot of these ideas with social practices and try to foster social practices which are more relational. One of these practices is very interesting, and it's created tremendous enthusiasm, not only in this country but now globally. It's called appreciative inquiry. Bad title, appreciative inquiry. And what it amounts to is trying to move, when you have conflicts or divisions, trying to move in meaning in such a way that you can reconnect and to find discourses, ways of talking, which can recombine. Now, some of you may know about this already because you may know the Episcopal movement coming out of the Bishop of California for united religions. All right, something like the UN, but it would be a united religion, because most of the strife, or much of the strife in the world, as it said, not an international strife, it's interreligious. And the nations can't solve those problems. Religions have got to be called together to solve those problems. And it's an interesting idea, but the problem is getting those people together, because indeed they are in conflict and they don't trust each other. They are involved with divides of righteousness. So appreciative inquiry begins in the process of telling stories, sharing stories. It's very important which stories you share, but in this case, where people come together from these different religions and not argue about who's right and wrong, about the previous context and who's got the problem and how to solve the problem of the difference, but trying to share stories about what makes that religion really important to you. What in your experiences within that faith gives you joy, gives you a sense of purpose, gives you a sense of that things are really just where you want to go, or significance in your life. Sharing personal stories, you might say, of the sacred. Now, hearing those stories is a different thing than comparing, let's say, abstract theological positions, or who's got the right to do this or that. Hearing those stories, you can kind of take them on. You can begin to feel the resonance there, because they often are very much like what you feel. Typically, you can identify with those stories. You can see that, hey, this person is not unlike me. And there's something that gives that person joy that's not unlike the joy that I feel in what I do. And if that's the case, and this is the second part of appreciative inquiry, can we come together to find something which, in fact, unites us, and it unites us in a way that gives us a sense of really some place we want to go, somewhere some idea we both cherish. Time is spent then trying to hammer out those visions together. Even the process of hammering out those visions together is now a collaborative process, coordination process, not a fighting process, it's a coordination process. And then once those visions are given full flower, then trying in some way to say, well, how can we do that? What would be the pieces that we would need in this organization to make that happen? And this kind of process in various forms, because it does have many different forms, been used now in nonprofit organizations and businesses across the world, and religion. And to me, it's very heartening. Okay, another orientation which I found helpful. Honor our traditions as relational resources. Honor the traditions as relational resources. That is, we all exist within traditions that we find significant. We cherish those traditions. And there's no argument against that. We should honor those traditions. But rather than trying to look at those as traditions which we must sustain in their original form, try to look at them as resources for how it is we may go on to now. That is, as mutable resources which can be used now and put into different contexts with different meanings to enable us to carry out and coordinate relationships at this time. So rather than, for example, looking at biblical scriptures or religious traditions as something which we must sustain in their original form, look at those as traditions which grew up at particular times, history, culture, in which there's a great deal of wisdom involved, in which there are insights and proclamations and so on, which may be useful for us, but useful for us now, not in the sense of trying to go back and simply repeat them over and over again, but in the sense of trying to take them out and use them in a different context so they do something else, so they sustain their vitality in terms of their immutable replacement of those and the replacing of those in another context. It's like finding scriptures, taking them out of one context and making them do something in another context. They will change their meaning, but it sustains the tradition but keeps it vital. Now let me give you one example that I've found very useful, and that is to think about love. We have a strong tradition in the Christian faith of love, an investment in love. Love is somehow central to our conception of what it is to be good. But that conception of love, while it's enormously important, also in its form in which we inherit it, has some problems. Consider, we are asked to love our neighbors as ourselves, to nurture and cherish and care for those around us. And when we do that, we have a special blessing. We can feel very good about ourselves. But notice the hero of that story is us. We love, therefore we are prized. We get the credit. We are okay, God, fine. The person who receives that love, receives that gift, well, a little bit less so. Not concerned about that. That's not the hero of the story. If that person happens to be ungrateful, I mean, that's really awful because they have been loved. So they're really, totally déclassé. So it's a love story in the sense where we individually get to be the heroes. Now, what if we took that kind of love story and tried to change it into a relational story? What would that look like? Now, here I find Eric Fromm interesting. Eric Fromm tried to argue at one point, love is a power which produces love. Think about that one for a minute. A relationship of love is a relationship which begets or fosters relationship. So the greater the love, the greater the relational coordinations possible. I'll give you an example. My wife Mary and I worked for a number of years doing research on foreign aid. Particularly, we're interested in all the various sorts of aid programs, both nonprofit and governmental, and the way in which they were received, and the kind of impact they had on various other countries. We go around and visit these countries. And what you find out is that there is a great deal of ingratitude among people who receive these sorts of gifts. Anger, frustration. We send, for example, to North Africa, when they were having troubles with famine, we send peanuts for the people to eat because they're a quick and simple form of nourishment. But for them, this is food for swine, livestock. It was awful. You wouldn't eat a peanut. It would be like saying, well, if you're starving today, if you don't feel like you're getting enough nourishment, let me send you some hog slop. Eat that. You'll feel better. So it was resisted. Or cases where we would try to send new crops which would grow more rapidly, and you unsettle all the local customs, all the local knowledge base of how their crops work. Or cases in which, particularly on a national level, where we give aid, it seems to be a sign of friendship. I mean, that's the seal on our packages of grain and so on, where it seems a sign of friendship. And then we come along and say, well, look, if you had the grain, and now we want a base on your land, or we want an economic subsidy or something. So we obligate and alienate. Now, these to me are not acts of love. Yeah, we might feel good about them, but they are not acts of love in the sense of a relational form of love, which would take into account those with whom we are having that relationship, which would coordinate ourselves with those people. That is, that it's in the coordination that the love is created, not in my head, not in my bosom. And by the same token, a love within a family is a limited form of love if it simply remains in the family. Can one think of the possibility of love in the family which would enable that family to coordinate outside, which would combine within the community? Or love for a community which somehow will enable that community to coordinate with other communities. And as love would be that kind of process which would build on the process of relating itself. And I find that interesting and challenging as a possible way of thinking about action. Finally, could we, and this is sort of an orientation that I find very useful myself, extend that process of thinking about relational love to nature itself, to the inanimate, to the biological, the material world? Because after all, the process of relationship that I've been talking about is largely a human one. That is, I've said we make the meaning together. It's largely been a us together. But after all, what is to separate us from everything else? Isn't the very attempt to sort of say I am and make the skin the boundary between me and you and the world kind of arbitrary? If I didn't have the air to breathe, if it were 30 degrees warmer up here, I wouldn't exist. I am part of the world. And that if we are to look at the divine, the sacred as inhabiting relationship, we've got to take into account the divine character of our relationship with all the else that exists. And here's Martin Buber. The relation with God includes and encompasses the possibility of relation with all otherness. And I rather like that sentiment. It allows us to form some kind of unity with a deep ecology movement, with ecofeminism, which are traditions that try to break beyond the notion of a person, a sealed person in themselves, who uses nature or may be threatened by nature, but who want to see people as part of nature. And I think in the long run, this would be parts of machines, mechanical world. It would be part of everything else. All of that would have sacred potential. That is when, and here's Elliot Frodman, the natural world, when we in the sense that the natural world invades us or becomes part of us at the same time as we come to experience ourselves as animal, as vegetable, and mineral, as these are parts of ourselves. They constitute us. So when we see ourselves as part of the world, as potentially coordinated or not with that world, we then have the capacity to invest or find manifest the sacred in all actions, all the time. Now, I began this talk with a song, and I'd like to finish off with yet another auditory icon. And this comes from a bit of 15th century sacred music, if you could. Here we are. This is polyphonic music from the 15th century. If you can separate it out from the sirens. And what's interesting about this music is that the people who are singing it, and all of them have a different part, and this one is, I think these are octets, all of them who are singing have different parts, and there's no leader, there's no conductor, there's no written notes that they're following, there's no beat or rhythm which allows them to coordinate. They have to coordinate those voices, listening very carefully to how everyone, where they stop, where they pause, where they are, and they're likely generally to stand in a cluster with their bodies next to each other, with their faces looking at each other, coordinating those sounds so that they can be perfectly matched, so that they create beauty in the coordination. So in some sense, this is like an icon. This is, in some sense, the relational realization of the sacred. If we turn that up just a bit. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. What a wonderful journey you just took us on.
Sure.
I think my favorite sentence in the whole talk was, the relational process is inhabited by a divine presence, which sums up, for me, what we've been talking about here for 2 days. That all of the relational processes we find in us and around us are somehow inhabited by a divine presence, and I think you've really done a wonderful job of bringing that all together for us at the end, and I want to thank you.
You're very welcome.
I want to explore, I want to welcome calls and faxes and emails and questions from the floor here, please, but you triggered a lot of things in me, and I want to open with a question. You reminded me of a book I've read recently by a neuroscientist. It's actually a favorite book of Anna First. She turned me on to it. It's by Andy Clark, and it's called Being There, Putting Mind, Body, and World Together Again. And his argument is much like yours when it comes to relational ontology. That is, that we can no longer just think of ourselves as minds or as minds plus bodies, but we are mind plus body plus the world. And that that you cannot think of us apart from the relationships that constitute us. And we tend to think, when we talk about relationality or relationships, we tend to think of the individual, and the relationship is sort of secondary.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, and you picked it up in Colin Gunton as well, as you talked about it, that you and Colin are really talking about something different in perichoresis. And I'd like to have you just unpack that a little bit more for us, because I think that's...
The part of the problem here is that we're faced with is that, again, we inherit the sort of traditions of talking or describing or understanding that already limit us in powerful ways, and it's difficult to step out of those traditions and make sense. And to me, one of the most difficult traditions is that, we have nouns, the central of the language, and nouns happen to be those kinds of linguistic practices which divide and segment the world. To have something, to name it, is to segment it. To talk about an it is to segment it. So it's very difficult to talk about anything without buying into a segmentation process. So I can talk about individuals we want to talk about individuals as building a relationship, or talk about individual parts within the perichoresis as forming a relationship. But to talk about what constitutes the relationship, we fall back on nouns again. And we can't help it. So then I begin to ask myself, well, is it possible that we could look at nouns as sort of place markers? That is, we just hold a space. I say, here I am, this is me. But don't take that seriously in the sense of now it's a delineated, truly delineated person. It's just a placeholder in the conversation. Because I could other ways see myself as very much part of the natural world, very much part of a set of communities. I could see everything I'm saying as really coming through dialogues that I've already had. So that what I'm saying seems to come from this person, but that person is kind of an illusion. I'm actually, their families and friends and colleagues and so on, all participating right now, right here. Now, that's another way of understanding it, but as soon as I talk about families and friends and so on and dialogue, there are more nouns, more placeholders. And every time I go to one and say, well, what is that then? Now I've got to unpack and say, well, it was only a placeholder in the conversation for a moment, but if you look at it in another way, you can see it too is formed of relational process.
You bringing up the semantic problems that we have reminds me of what's going on in physics, where physics is based traditionally or classically on the notion of location. I mean, Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle is about the fact that if you can't locate something and measure its dimension, you can't understand it. But physicists are now discovering that what they call non-locality, that is, it is impossible to isolate any individual entity and consider it apart from its relationships to the world. And it's just interesting semantically, because I think it corroborates what you're saying, is that the word locate is positive, and the one that talks about relationality is negative, non-locality.
Yeah.
And that is sort of a semantic problem we have, I think.
Yeah. It's a hard
Take
one.
a question from the floor.
Thanks very much for a wonderful talk. I loved all of it. I agreed with everything. But I want to come back to your first question when you were 12. And given the trouble of nouns and I questions, what do you think is a more fruitful way of asking a question like, do I truly believe, than asking, do I truly believe?
What's a more fruitful
How would
way?
how would you reformulate that question in a way that helps people get at the relationality of the sacred?
I'll give you an example, a personal example. I went through another struggle like that. My wife, Mary, likes very much when I say I love you. I mean, she likes that as part of what we do. And in our early part of our marriage, she would say that to me, and she would expect me to say it in return. But I was going through some of this sort of, well, how do I know I love? You know, that kind of problem. What would I look at? And I was laboring through that. And I don't know how to answer that. I mean, biologically or idealistically, or, you know, what exactly how to answer that? She said, after a while, in frustration, don't try to answer it, just say it. Which in some sense is to say, engage in that form of relationship, in that form of process, which draws us together.
The reason that you say it is because the meaning is in the relationship.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's why you say it. I've got a fax here from Naples, Florida. If you alienate and isolate a person completely from all relationships and context and communication, does not that person still have worth and value and meaning to God?
Well, you know, what happens with, and this may come up again, so I'll just say it once and we'll see what the implications are. What happens with these questions about what is ultimate, would that person still have a relation with God, is it's like saying that with Nelson Goodman, I don't know how to answer that question outside of a given frame of reference.
Well, let's give you one. How about somebody with Alzheimer's who's unable to?
Yeah, but let's say that if I come into that person with Alzheimer's and I come out of a religion, let's say like Christian faith, that person will have value. If I come out of a certain ethical position, which is now becoming popular, would say, look, that person has no more value in society because they've lost the capacity to relate. And now let's say, look, we've got these two traditions, and maybe there are others. Economic positions, medical positions, and so on. Let's not solve that problem as like the problem that we've got to know if that person is right, or God exists, or God would look uncharitably at what we do, or if we let that person go. But it's to say, let's talk about that. Let's try to share these kinds of concerns and try to work in some kind of amalgamated way towards something we can live with together. So answering ultimate questions as if I could look at those from some perspective, which I can stand outside tradition, I can't do that. I don't know how to do it.
I would be inclined to say maybe that though that person is no longer in relationship, that or unable to enter into relationship, the fact that we can enter into relationship with them creates the value.
Yeah, all right, good. I like that. That's another way to go. If I were to take a sort of relational standpoint, and that were my frame, then you end up saying, look, it's not the person hasn't got the problem. Alzheimer's is a way of being. The problem is how to relate with that, how to coordinate with that person. Not to treat them as a problem person, therefore, but how do we relate? I mean, the same holds true for something like attention deficit disorder. I mean, we treat children who are hyperactive as if they got the problem. So we treat them, and we give them therapy, and we give them pharmacology. They are problem people, but why are they problem people? Why isn't the problem in the form of relationship which we form with them? They've only got a problem if we have a rigid set of relationships. Why not change the conditions under which we relate so that hyperactivity indeed could be part of the coordination?
Right. We go to the floor.
It strikes me that what is summarized here and we found throughout the conference is a new understanding of who we are. Who am I? And essentially what the Christian faith, and I think John in his gospel sees it most vividly, is a recognition that the partners who are God created us and equipped us to partner with them, him, God. And we have that equipment, and right in our biology, that equipment happens. We are launched in that direction until our self-isolating, solipsistic option takes hold. And out of that fragments not only our intuitive, innate rapport with God, but our rapport with one another. And out of that fragmenting then comes the need for the intervention, which God did personally, so as to heal this arbitrary breaking of our intuitive rapport, and to open for us a new and fresh, vivid relationship, a real relationship which actually restores to us our fundamental identity as partnering persons, partnering with God, and partnering with one another.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
It's a wonderful statement. We'll take one question left on the floor, and then we're going to go to a phone, and we'll try to make these quick.
You mentioned earlier the sacred as being the provider of value within various language games in an imminent way. And my question was two-part. One, can we look at various traditions of disciplines of thought as having variances in what they contain is just from the base criterion of value? So in other words, is there something equal in value, or can we, in taking that criterion, separate maybe
the question of relativism of value? Is that what you're asking?
Right, that's part of it. And that's the first question. The second question would be, in looking at a ethical criterion that runs across all disciplines, might we not be able to look at the vows of closure and openness that can reside within any discipline in against its relation to other disciplines?
I think we would have to sit down and talk for a while to really unpack all the implications of that.
Let me invite the two of you to do that, because I think we want to take one quick phone call, and then. So Greg, could you and Ken get together after we're done, or do you want to try to do that?
Let me just take one piece of that, because you've got a lot of really interesting. I think what is not being argued here is a kind of relativism or any value is as good as any other value. It's not the point of what's being said here in terms of locating values within clusters of relations. Because we're always in some set of relations where there is some value which is going to be more important to us than any other. You can't step outside and just simply have just sort of a God's eye perspective and I have no value, I just look them over. They're always already in some relational cluster, so something will be the good from which you function. I do have some doubt about, and I respect it, but doubt about universal values, the search for universal values, bills of rights. I think up to a point they're good because they can bring people together to talk about what we share. But when you start locking them in place, you also begin to set the ends of conversation. That is, certain people get to be the evil, and you stop certain kinds of discussions, and they become victims of your value schema. So I always like to have, wherever I'm sort of stating values, to have a certain kind of humility about that. Yes, I have values. Yes, there are things that I would fight for. Yes, they're important to me. And yes, I will go to picket lines and I'll send money and so on and so on and so on. But I always want this reflexive move which says, yes, but. There's limits to that. Be careful not to let it just overstate it, just leap out of its boundaries and become like a dominant discourse and yet another totalitarianism.
Thank you, Ken, and I think we're going to make it the wrap that we're over time. Thanks so much.
Oh, please.
Now we're going to do something that was unscheduled. Over dinner last night with these speakers, I discovered, and we all discovered, that they need to talk to each other and to have some time. We didn't schedule a final panel, and we're not going to do that because that would be much longer than I think the time allows. So what we're going to do is get them back up here right now. Anna, come on up. And we're going to ask them to do a little appreciative inquiry with one another, now that you know what appreciative inquiry is, to sort of talk about what they've heard from each other that has really stimulated them, and just briefly give them the opportunity to talk to you about their work and how this conference has enhanced their sense of what's really important. So come on up, Warren. For those of you who are watching on the downlink, this will probably take 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll close out. Unfortunately, Colin Gunton had a commitment, and so he is not able to join us for this, and we wish he could be here, but it was something very impromptu that we all decided we wanted to do last night. So who wants to go first? Anybody want to jump in there? Did anybody give you a mic? Where's? It lies on the floor. There we go. Warren, you got it.
Well, I'll make a comment of one kind that's sort of a broad idea that's worth perhaps injecting into the conversation. And I've been thinking during these conversations about Donald Mackay's idea that all knowledge is a conditional readiness to reckon. That is, it's not, knowledge is not ephemeral. It's not mind that is joined with our bodies, but everything that we know has implications for my readiness to reckon with the world. That is, in fact, what knowledge is. So, for example, if you tell me that Fred Burnham here is packing a gun under that suit, then I now have a different readiness to reckon with Fred than I would have had you not told me that. And I think it has to do with this idea of mirror neurons, how that we develop empathy by interacting with the world. We develop a readiness to reckon with the world and to think about the world in different ways. And I thought about it as I was sitting there in terms of dialogue. One of you're talking about the distances between academic disciplines, and one of the things I think there is we have a readiness to reckon with certain material in my discipline, certain experiments, theories, knowledge, but I'm not ready to reckon with what you know yet. And so part of the dialogue is to expand. Yeah, no guns. It's part of the dialogue is a readiness to reckon with a wider understanding of the world. To reckon, for example, with evolutionary biology, if I haven't thought in that world yet.
I'll say a little something to that. I used to think the word university came from one truth, but apparently it doesn't. It comes from the Latin meaning to turn or something. But still the idea is right, that there should be a place to bring the truths back into a coherent whole. And I think that's the challenge of our age. It's very clear to me that with our new stages of inquiry in biological sciences, that the reductive analytical analysis means to break something apart to look at it. And if it's true that there are emergent properties that we need a top-down analysis, that you some sense only understand the lower in terms of the higher, that in a sense you start with a fullness, and that human beings understand what they do only by a kind of ontological subtraction from the fullness of knowledge that comes from the total picture, then we need to keep alive in the intellectual tradition, and certainly in this encounter between the spiritual tradition and the academic tradition, this effort to bridge all these varied dialogues. And I think that's the challenge of our age. We've sequenced the genome, great. So now we know all these individual genes, supposedly individual genes. And now we go on to what's called functional genomics, trying to make sense of the system. It's going to lead very quickly into a greater appreciation how nothing is what it is unless it's in the context of itself, the larger context. In fact, molecules become, in certain sense, less than they are when they become bound into biological systems, because they are limited by the structures they're in. So you can't just take things apart and say, well, what are they? They are what they are within system, and that's the larger challenge of our age, I think.
It's kind of funny that the three of us have met previously before on various other conferences, so that was, and I always happen to agree with most of they have to say, and I share a lot of common ground, but just what you said I wanted to pick up because I strongly disagree. And I think that kind of this concept of relational ontology is so fundamental for my thinking that I cannot conceive of one truth that we have to try to go for, and that I absolutely hate to work towards coherency. Meaning that, of course, we try to make sense out of the world by creating coherence. There's no question about that. But we have to be aware that coherency does not lie in the system itself, but the coherency is created in interaction and the collection of various stories. I kind of like this image of Wittgenstein's family resemblance. You know, you look at the big family photo of let's say 100 people who are all relatives, or let's say 50, and from the very left one to the very right one, if you would see those two together, they would be absolutely different. But when you see all of them together, some sharing the same nose, some sharing the same eyebrows, some sharing the same forehead, whatever, you discover that they're all connected. Even though you cannot really pinpoint it down to a particular characteristic in that family. And I like that metaphor a lot for the construction of the world we live in. What I was trying to do yesterday is how much our perception of the world and our interaction with the world is interactive, how much is created in us, how much is created in others, and this whole interaction between us, meaning in relationship, right? And meaning not in me or in you. And giving that reality, every attempt to create an overall system that is coherent, where everything fits, in my opinion, reduces the beautiful manifoldness of this world. Because to really create coherency, you always have to exclude things that won't fit. So take, for instance, our understanding of the mind as distinguished from the body. And take this whole discussion after your talk yesterday about monism and dualism, right? I mean, in a way, for me, both positions are okay. Because we can perceive ourselves as having a body, and we can perceive ourselves as being a body. And both stories are equally valid. And so instead of kind of saying it has to be the one or it has to be the other, otherwise there is no coherency, we might just let them both be accepted side by side and know what concept to use in what context. Well.
Yeah, I subscribe to most of what you've said. I think of students who write papers, and for a long time, the emphasis was on coherence, and so everything had to fit logically together on the whole structure and be unassailable. And frequent way of criticizing students was this doesn't fit with that, or this contradicts that, and so on. But over time, I've gotten to realize the sense that what happens with a coherence, and it's much like what you're saying, is that it's bought at the suppression of an enormous number of other voices. You may be writing that essay, and every paragraph you may see, in fact, have another voice that says, well, wait a minute, there are problems with this, and I don't really subscribe to that, but it fits with this, so I'm not going to write that. So now I have students write papers where they can write them in multiple voices and look at all the facets of possibilities, and I rather like that. But let me add to this one other thing, which I am very happy with the new dialogues between science and religion. I mean, they've been so often antithetical, with science representing the Enlightenment and religion representing the pre-Enlightenment and so on, and the ways in which religion has been sort of removed from curricula, looked at as sort of second-rate, and everything's become science. And so to have these kind of mutually respecting dialogues, I think is fantastic. I think it's just where we ought to be. One worry with this enterprise, though, and I think maybe we share the worry, is that the scientific perspective, the coherence of that perspective, has a way of sucking in the religious, has a way of desacralizing. Once you try to extend that scientific perspective out, you almost inevitably will reduce. I was thinking today of you mentioned the Newsweek on the physiological basis of God, and where you take groups of praying people and you find what's happening with the brain when they pray and what's happening when they forgive and so on, and you take nuns and you take people who are meditating and you find different parts of the brain that are activated when you're doing these activities, and therefore the conclusion is drawn, what we do when we pray is fundamentally biological. Now, that's like saying somehow if we to wire up people who were acting Hamlet, we would say Hamlet is biologically based. Or if we have people running the 100-yard dash and the muscles move a lot, that 100-yard dashes are derived and have their origins in the muscles. And it's a silly kind of argument, but it has a certain coherence to it. So I guess what I don't want to lose is the way in which languages of the sacred function within society. I don't want to lose that, the way in which they enable us to do things like have charity for each other and care for each other and nurture each other. Because the more we reduce them, the more that whole utility of that language disappears.
Let me carry on the dispute a little bit and advance my point a little bit, I think. If to know anything is a conditional readiness to reckon, it has a behavioral cost. And the behavioral cost comes in my commitment to do something. I've got to act in the world. And so the only problem with a dialogue where every point is just considered somewhat in the abstract is I have somehow to boil that down to find some resonance, to find some position from which to act. So if you tell me, instead of having a gun, Fred has a wad of bills that he plans to pass out after this thing, then, oh, there you go. Then my readiness to reckon with Fred is very different than whether or not I have to commit. I have got to do something. I know, all right. So the one place that the dialogue, to me, gets, needs another element than just appreciating the various points of view is somehow we need a process to go from points of view to readiness to act.
Well, I was thinking, as I was listening to your really beautiful, rich, wise talk, I felt like I learned a lot personally. And yet, at the same time, I kept thinking to myself about your earliest comment about, do I really have faith? And I know I see that from a slightly different perspective because periodically I deal with people who have diseases, disorders, and they know that faith has something to do with healing, and we've now established a pretty reasonable case for that in studies of the relationship to faith and medicine. So your attitude toward yourself makes a difference. Your attitude toward hope for healing and so forth makes a difference. And people, especially in certain traditions where faith is everything, would say to themselves, well, if only I have faith, I could be healed. And yet that's exactly where the problem is, because you're afraid. You don't have enough faith. So how are you going to get the faith that you need to be healed? And so it's sort of this strange problem. How do you know if you have faith? How do you get faith? And it comes down to something else, and that is that there's something beyond us, something that beckons to us. I like the idea of openness, and I don't actually disagree with most of what you said, but I kept thinking as you were talking, yes, relationships are wonderful. Relationships distill out truths. They build up structures. How do you know that the relationship you're in isn't building a false structure, one that leads to collapse, one that leads to corruption, one that leads to a reduction or degradation of the self? There is something both good about openness and freedom. There's also something to be said for the structure of good. Freedom is the ability to do the good. And finally, I need reference back to, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say. It's like there is something real. There is something ultimate. There is a good in the world. I want to be in a relationship and have a religious faith that resonates with the deepest good, not just a relational situation, unless you believe that relationships intrinsically bring out good, but then you have to contend with a lot of evil relationships in human history. What do you think?
I would like to close on that affirmation, that faith statement. After all we've been through, I think that's a very good place to stop. And I'd like to ask the rector of Trinity Church, Dr. Matthews, to come back and sign us all off.
We'll start with the chair that's sitting right here and thank Colin